To wrap up Chapter 9 then, what I want to do is look at some common disease inheritance patterns that we might see in humans. And so there are many, many types of disease inheritance patterns, and many of them are very complex, but I just want to look at a few of the basic and the more common patterns, and then look at some specific disease examples for those. One of the major goals then in the field of genetics is to figure out disease inheritance patterns. Again, lots of genetic counselors today, for example, working in places like hospitals, working with couples that are concerned, my uncle has this particular disease, what are the odds that maybe I would pass that disease on to my offspring? And so trying to determine these inheritance patterns and the likelihood of certain diseases being passed on. Now, by far, most traits and most genes are what we would call autosomal traits, or autosomal genes, meaning they're located on one of our first 1 through 22 autosomes, or chromosomes that we all share in common. And since this is the bulk of our DNA, 22 out of our 23 pairs of chromosomes are autosomal, most of our genes are autosomal, which means if we have a genetic disorder, the gene that's causing the problem is probably going to be an autosomal trait. And it's probably going to affect men and women the same, because we all have 2 copies of each autosomal chromosome. Where we may see a difference, though, as we mentioned last time, is with a sex-linked trait. And again, while it's technically a gene located on the X or Y, we know that in reality, sex-linked traits in humans are located on the X chromosome, since the Y has very, very little genetic information. And as we pointed out in the last audio lecture, the sex-linked traits are going to have a bigger impact on men than women, since men only have 1 X chromosome. So let's look at 3 of our more common patterns and look at some examples, and certainly they will be influenced by whether or not they're autosomal versus sex-linked. One pattern we may observe is autosomal dominant. So autosomal on one of those autosomal chromosomes, dominant meaning it takes just 1 copy of that dominant allele for that disease to be expressed or to show up, meaning a big A would be the disease-causing allele, and lowercase a, the recessive A, is the wild type or the healthy allele. And so in this case, if you have just 1 big A, you're going to have the disorder. And so if you're big A or big A little a genotypes, you would have the phenotype of having the symptoms of this particular genetic disease. And the only way to not have the symptoms would be if you have 2 copies of little a. Now remember, these diseases are very rare, and so there's not many big A's floating around out there. But if you get a big A from either parent, you would have one of these dominant disorders. And if we look at that inheritance pattern in a family, how would a dominant disorder be passed on in a family? Since it only takes 1 copy of the disease allele to have the symptoms, we see a very specific inheritance pattern. For example, if we look at children that are affected by the disease, meaning they have the disease here, they always have 1 parent with the disease that's affected by the same disorder. And hopefully that makes sense, right? Because if a child has a disease, that means they have a big A. That big A had to come from somebody, and so that means either their mother or their father would have had the big A and would have had the same genetic disorder. Now, if I've got 2 parents without the disease, so they're unaffected by the disease, so they both have little a as their genotype, we know that all their children are going to be unaffected, that they will not have any kids with the disease, because their kids are going to get nothing but little a's from each parent. The reverse, though, is not true. I could have, theoretically, I may not in real life because these are rare diseases, but on paper, if I had 2 affected parents, meaning 2 parents with the disease, while most of their kids we would expect to have the disorder, they could have a child that does not have the disorder, that's unaffected. Right? If both parents were big A, little a, 1 out of 4 of their kids might get 2 little a's and not have that genetic disorder. And so our main issue here with these dominant disorders is they never skip a generation. If we have a child with the disorder, that means one of their parents had the disorder, and one of their parents, and it tends to show up every generation. And because it is autosomal, we would expect men and women to be equally affected, so an equal percentage of men and women to have the autosomal dominant disorders. And we try to observe inheritance patterns in families by looking at what's called a pedigree. And a pedigree shows us 2 things. It shows us, number 1, how are people related to each other, and then number 2, who has a particular trait or disease and who doesn't. So in this case, we're looking at our pedigree. In the pedigree, each generation has a Roman numeral, so we're looking at 3 generations here, sort of like grandparents, parents, and then kids. Each individual in the pedigree is numbered just so we know who we're talking about. Men are always written as squares on pedigrees. Women are always written as circles. Okay? If you have the particular disorder, it's usually filled in, and if you don't have a particular disorder or disease, it's going to be open or blank like that. Okay? And so if we have a man and a woman that are connected with a horizontal line, that means that that's a couple having kids. And so, for example, in generation 2, individuals 1 and 2, that's a man with the disorder, a woman without, and they had 3 kids. A boy with the disorder, a boy without, and a daughter without. Okay? So we're seeing those relationship aspects there. In this case, this is actually a real pedigree of a family that has a dominant disorder called brachydactyly. And brachydactyly is when you have a 6th finger or a 6th toe. So you have an extra finger or toe. Usually it's a finger, sometimes it could be a toe. And here we see the pattern that we just talked about. Notice that for every person on the pedigree that has the disorder, if we go up to a parent, one of their parents has the disorder. And then if we go up another generation to the next parent, they have the disorder. So it never skips a generation. If there's a person with it, we can trace it all the way back. Because it's a dominant disorder, there's nowhere for that big A to hide. Likewise, notice that we've got several men and several women with the disorder. So it is autosomal. Both sexes are going to be equally affected by something like brachydactyly. And since these are relatively rare disorders, what we typically see is one parent who has the disorder could be big A, but most likely they're big A, little a. Again, because these big A's are rare. There's not that many of them out there. And so by far the most common pattern we see here is one parent is heterozygous, the other parent has 2 little a's and doesn't have the disease. And if that's the case, their kids kind of have a 50-50 shot. Half their kids might get the big A from that parent and have the disorder, half might get the little a and they won't. And so while there are many inheritance patterns, this is by far the most common that we see with these dominant disorders. And while dominant disorders can certainly affect quality of life, I don't know that I would want a 6th finger, they typically aren't lethal. That 6th finger probably isn't going to kill you or be a fatal situation. Now there are many very fatal, very serious genetic disorders, but not in the dominant category, not in this pattern. Okay? And hopefully if you think about it, that makes sense why that would be, right? If big A was lethal, especially early in life, then if someone had big A, they would never survive to pass on the big A. And so we wouldn't see that big A or that disease in the population very long. It would disappear very quickly. And so most of these dominant disorders are more quality of life and not necessarily life-threatening disorders. Having said that, one of the more common dominant disorders actually is one of the most serious genetic disorders, and that's Huntington disease, something you may be familiar with. Huntington disease is relatively common, probably in the top 40 or 50 genetic disorders here in the U.S. About 1 in 20,000 people born in the U.S. is born with Huntington. Okay? The major symptom of Huntington is it's a brain disorder, and the brain tissue slowly degenerates and dies off. And we know that central nervous tissue like the brain and spinal cord doesn't regrow and replace itself. And so as that brain tissue is lost, we see function as being lost. And people often, first symptoms have problems with motor control and develop tics, eventually leading to paralysis, and then eventually to death. And in fact, it's a very painful, very slow way to die. Again, Huntington is a very, very devastating type of disease. The symptoms of Huntington are very similar to something you're maybe more familiar with, something like Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a different brain disorder, but very similar type of external symptoms. Well, we just said that these disorders shouldn't be lethal. If someone has this, how could they ever pass on that Huntington allele? Well, the way that Huntington gets around it, the loophole that we see, is Huntington's symptoms aren't expressed until later in life. Typically, a common range we might see Huntington diagnosed is between the ages of 40 and 50 years old. And so by that time, many people have already passed on their genes and their alleles, and so they may have passed on that big A for Huntington disease and not even be aware that they had the big A until it's too late. Okay? And Huntington disease is really a frustrating aspect of our genetics today. We know a tremendous amount about it. We know the gene, we know the mutation that causes it. We can do a genetic test and tell you if you have that big A, but we can't fix it. There's no known cure. We really can't do much because it's a brain disorder. It's very, very difficult to treat. The gene happens to be on chromosome number 4, so it is one of those autosomes. And while a test is available, it's probably one of the least given tests out there. Because if you're 20 years old or 25 and you're thinking about having kids, do you really want to know what's going to happen to you in 15 years or so if you're going to develop this incurable, slow, painful sort of disorder? And in fact, the only people that tend to get this test are people that have a parent that has this disease. And again, if you have a parent, you have about a 50-50 shot of getting the disease yourself, and many people don't want to pass on that big A. If they see a parent going through and see how painful and slow that death is, they may opt to not have children if they have the big A and not pass on that genetic disorder. Another common pattern of disease inheritance is autosomal recessive, and in fact, this is by far the most common pattern we see in humans. Probably somewhere between 75 to 80% of all of our genetic disorders would fall into the category of autosomal recessive. And since it's recessive, what that means is that the dominant allele, big A, is the wild type or the healthy allele, and the only way to get these disorders is to have 2 copies of that recessive allele, 2 copies of little a. And so if you're a big A or big A little a, you don't have the disorder, although this is a case where if you're big A little a, you're a carrier, meaning you don't have the disorder, but you have the potential to pass on the disease. And all of us are undoubtedly carriers for some rare genetic disorders, and we're probably completely unaware of it. And we'll probably never be aware that we're carriers unless we happen to get together with someone who is a carrier for the same exact rare recessive disorder. And if that happens, we have the potential then of having a child that's little a, and that would be a child then that would have the disorder. Now, because it takes 2 copies of this allele to have the disorder, that means it has to come from both sides of the family, so we're going to see a very different pattern of inheritance than we saw with that dominant pattern. In recessive disorders, most kids that have the disorder have 2 healthy parents. And so by far, our most common pattern is to have 2 parents that are carriers, big A, little a, and then all of a sudden they have a child with little a. And so it seemingly kind of pops up out of nowhere. Now, if we had 2 parents with the disease, all of their children we would expect to have the disease. And again, this is a theoretical thing. I don't know that this would ever happen. But if we had 2 parents, they would both be little a, obviously all their kids would get little a's as well. And our main characteristic here is it tends to skip generations, to disappear and reappear within families. But again, most of us don't know our family history and don't know what did everyone in our family die 2, 3, 4 generations ago to know if this disease runs in our family. So oftentimes these recessive diseases do seem to pop out of nowhere. All of a sudden there's a child with a disease that nobody's heard of before, and it turns out that if we knew about the history of the family maybe 4 generations ago, it had already popped up somewhere else. Now, it is autosomal, so we would expect both men and women to be equally affected by these recessive disorders. So here's a typical pedigree for a recessive disorder. Again, we've got kids at the bottom there in generation 3 that pop up out of nowhere with the disease. Now, if we have children with a recessive disorder, we know their parents must have been carriers. And so sometimes we fill in carriers halfway on something like a pedigree here to indicate that they passed on the disease but didn't have it themselves. Although oftentimes, again, we may have carriers and we may not know it. So they may be completely open and we don't find out they're carriers until we see what they passed on to their children. And unlike dominant disorders, where most dominant disorders are quality of life but don't really have a huge impact on fatality or lethal issues, recessive disorders, many of them are very, very severe and certainly can be life-threatening. And I want to look at an example here of one of the more common ones, and that's a disorder called phenylketonuria, or we abbreviate it as PKU. Now, PKU is probably in the top 5 or 10 in terms of common genetic disorders. About 1 in 5,000 people born in the U.S. is born with PKU. And the main symptom here, if you have PKU, is you lack an enzyme that breaks down a particular chemical called phenylalanine. And phenylalanine is one of the 20 amino acid building blocks we use to make proteins. And this is actually a very common story with a lot of genetic disorders, is here's a chemical that our body needs a little bit of. But if we get too much, we need to be able to metabolize that chemical and break it down and get rid of it so that we can process it and it doesn't become a problem. And so normally we need a little bit of phenylalanine. If we have a lot of protein in our diet, we get a lot of phenylalanine. We get too much, we can break it down into urea and get rid of it as a waste product in our urine. But if you have PKU, you have no way to break down that phenylalanine. It can build up and become toxic. And unfortunately, our body's response to too much phenylalanine is to start shipping it to brain cells and storing it up in the brain. And the major symptom here of PKU is very, very severe mental retardation, very severe developmental problems. And usually it's seen in infants because once an infant is born, again, these recessive disorders tend to skip generations. So an infant may be born with PKU, and either parent probably has never even heard of PKU. That baby, if it's breastfed, is getting protein from the milk. If it's bottle fed, it's getting protein from the formula. Those proteins will have phenylalanine, and usually by the time the PKU was diagnosed, we're talking about a year-old or maybe an 18-month-old infant before you can really tell there's developmental problems. Things aren't progressing as they should, and by the time that happens, usually it's too late. The damage to the brain cells has already been done, and again, we can't undo them. So a very frustrating disorder, PKU, because by the time we could diagnose it, it was really kind of too late to really treat it. And whereas Huntington was our example of a disorder that is frustrating because we haven't had much success even though we've learned about it, PKU is sort of the flag us geneticists wave as our success story, because there are genetic tests available for PKU, and in fact every infant today that's born in a hospital in the United States is tested for PKU. And so what happens is right after birth, usually they'll give mom and the infant a night to recover from birth. Then the next day they'll take the infant and they'll wheel him or her off to the nursery and do a heel stick, take a little blood sample. They'll test that blood for phenylalanine levels. If they're higher than expected, that doesn't mean the infant has PKU, but it means they might be at higher risk. And so then they would take a blood sample and send it off to a lab to actually do the genetic test and to look for that PKU mutation. And if the infant does have PKU, it's very, very treatable. Basically, we can give the infant, and even all the way throughout the entire life, you would have to have this enzyme, so you can actually take the enzyme that you're not producing as a drug treatment. Also, we're going to have a specialized formula that's made in a lab with proteins that don't have any phenylalanine in it. So we're not going to increase phenylalanine levels. And so by testing early, by diagnosing it and treating it aggressively, basically we've seen the levels of mental retardation due to PKU just fall off the table, because now people are getting diagnosed before the damage is done, and it's been a very, very successful treatment program looking at PKU. And almost all of the genetic disorders you can think of probably fall into the category of autosomal recessive. Again, all the really common things like cystic fibrosis, which is a problem with salt channels and water regulation, Tay-Sachs disease, that's another one of these metabolic missing an enzyme kind of stories like PKU. We mentioned sickle cell anemia as an example of blood cell issues, albinism or lacking pigment. And we may think, well, if you don't have any melanin, you don't have pigment, you may look different, but actually that's a very, very serious health issue, because melanin absorbs UV light coming from the sun and prevents a lot of cancer. If you're an albino, we see very, very high rates of skin cancer associated with that. Another one common recessive disorder, galactosemia, is another one of these missing an enzyme kind of stories. And by far, our most common pattern of inheritance, again, is having two parents that are carriers and completely unaware that they're carriers most likely, and 1 out of 4 of their offspring have a chance then of having that recessive disorder. The last common inheritance pattern then is sex-linked. And we talked a little bit about sex-links last time, but that's going to be a trait on the X chromosome. The vast majority of them are recessive, and so X with a big A would indicate the wild type or the healthy allele that's on that X chromosome. The disease-causing allele would be X with a little a. And so we know that if men just get one X with a little a, men will have that disorder. For women, you would have to have 2 copies of that X with a little a. So if we look at inheritance patterns, we're going to see that maternal inheritance pattern. Men with the disorder get their X from mom, so it's going to be passed on from mother to son. Men can never be carriers for sex-linked traits, but women can be. They can pass it on even though they don't have that disorder. And again, these traits are going to have a very skewed sex ratio, very common in men, very rare, oftentimes not seen at all in women. Several examples kind of fall into this category of sex-linked inheritance. The most common one is MD, or muscular dystrophy. About 1 in 3,600 men in the U.S. is born with MD. It can occur in women, but it occurs so rarely it's even hard to get a count or a number because it's virtually absent in women. And the main symptom of muscular dystrophy is that muscle cells degenerate over time, usually starting in late adolescence and then throughout the teenage years. Historically, MD is fatal usually by kind of middle to late teens, although life expectancy, again, is increasing dramatically as we get better at treating it. It turns out there's a protein called dystrophin on our muscle cells, and as muscle cells slide back and forth when you contract your muscles, they take a real beating and they tend to die off. But we have this dystrophin, this protective muscle protein, that helps protect those cells and keeps them alive while they're sliding back and forth. If you have muscular dystrophy, though, you fail to make this protein. So your muscle cells are weaker, they tend to die off faster than you can replace them, and hence the symptoms here of these muscles gradually breaking down over time. Another common sex-linked disorder is something like hemophilia. Hemophilia, about 1 in 10,000 men is born with hemophilia. Again, it can occur in women, but very, very rare. Okay. You may be familiar with hemophilia. It's called Bleeder's disease. Basically, it's a problem clotting your blood. And there are 12 clotting factors, or 12 proteins that you need for your blood to clot that have to be present in your blood plasma. and missing just one of those results in blood that won't clot. And it turns out 2 of the clotting factor genes are on the X chromosome. The most common one that we see associated with hemophilia is a mutation in clotting factor number 8 out of the 12. And that's called hemophilia type B, and by far, again, the most common here. And it's going to be much more common in men than it is in women. And it makes sense that these sex-linked traits are much more common in men than women, but maybe not so much sense why is it so common in men but virtually absent in women. For example, if we see MD in 1 in every 3,600 men, maybe we should see it in 1 in every 20,000 or 30,000 or 100,000 women, but it's much, much more rare than even that, than we would predict. And so the reason has to do with this inheritance pattern. And if we take a look at the chart down here, the only way for a woman to have a sex-linked disorder is to have 2 copies of that disease-causing allele. In this case, it's written with an X with a little r. And so notice the only way for a woman to have that, not only would her mother have to be a carrier, and that's certainly possible, but she would have to get an X with a little r from dad. And to get an X with a little r from dad means that dad would have to have that disorder, because dad has nowhere to hide that X with a little r. And most of these disorders, historically like MD or hemophilia, are fatal. And so if it's a fatal disorder, men aren't going to live long enough to pass it on, and that's why we don't see many women with these disorders at all. Now, as our treatments for muscular dystrophy and hemophilia get better, we're seeing men live longer, so we are seeing men pass on that X with little r. So as a side consequence, we might expect to see in the next 50 years, for example, to start to see the number of women with disorders like muscular dystrophy or hemophilia start to increase, because now men can survive with that disorder and they may potentially then pass it on to their daughters. Every biology textbook, every history textbook has the same pedigree, and ours does not disappoint, and that's the pedigree for hemophilia, in particular the hemophilia associated with that factor 8 and how it's passed on in the royal families of Europe. And because the royal families, we have a good pedigree, we have a good history of who's related to who, we can track that down through many generations. And this hemophilia was in many branches, the English branch, the Russian branch with Alexis, the last group of the last Russian prince, for example, within the German, the Spanish royal family. We see it throughout. And this is a typical pattern of a sex-linked trait. Notice we've got all these men that are filled in. There are no women that are filled in. But for every man that has this disorder, we know his mother must have been a carrier, and so we can track it back through that maternal inheritance pattern. So just to summarize our disease inheritance, we talked about 3 major patterns: autosomal dominant, usually not fatal. It never skips generations. We can track it back from one child to their parent to their parent. And our example was Huntington disease, one of the more severe dominant disorders. Could be autosomal recessive. That's by far our most common pattern. It tends to disappear and reappear, kind of come out of nowhere. And our example was PKU, something that we're getting very good at diagnosing and treating. And then finally, sex-linked recessive traits going to be much more common in men, very rarely seen in women, things like muscular dystrophy, and they're going to have that maternal inheritance pattern.